Okay, I'm Bonnie Barati. I'm the Planetary Sciences Section Manager. And we have a tag team talk by Randall Smith and Serina Diniega. They're both experts and very active in the EDI field, equity, diversity, and inclusion. Randall is an astrophysicist from Center for Astrophysics, Harvard and Smithsonian, with a background in X-ray astrophysics. Serina Diniega is a mathematician by training, but has moved into the field of planetary sciences. And they're going to give a tag team talk on rules of the road. And thank you so much for doing this. It's, I know it's a hard subject to get into and very controversial, so go ahead.
Thank you very much, Bonnie, for that introduction and the invitation to present in the SVCP series here at JPL. I'm going to hand it off to Randall shortly for his portion of the presentation, but first we wanted to just introduce how we even got here. I started with a group that was looking to create a white paper for the Planetary Science and Astrobiology Decadal Survey, and I'll throw a link to that submitted white paper into the chat in just a moment. But basically, we saw mentions of code of conduct in the community, but we saw many inconsistencies in how it was being used, and we wanted to collate useful information for the science community. This would allow everyone to know what was expected of them and of everyone else on the team, so increased transparency and better practices within our community. Randall? And
I got started because I'm the PI of a proposed NASA Mid-X Explorer called ARCUS, and got asked the question of how the science team was going to work together, especially things like, how papers would be handled. And I realized that I didn't have a policy, we didn't have a policy on this, so I thought I would do what I normally do in these circumstances, which is copy from somebody else. Then I looked and I found that there really wasn't a template or a standard in this in any way, and so I then got interested in what should be the template, what should be the standards. I ended up writing a review that has now been accepted for publication in the Bulletin of the AAS. And so then basically Serina found out what I was doing and then emailed me and said, could we do something together? And I was happy to join on her white paper, and now we're doing this talk together. So next slide. So let's take the broad view for just a moment. Because you can imagine that you need a publication policy or a code of conduct in all sorts of scientific areas, as well as other areas of life. But in particular, NASA science teams are a bit unusual. They're often large. They are, relatively speaking, well-funded. If you don't feel that you're well-funded, try talking to somebody in the arts or the humanities for a few moments. And they may be short-lived, like Explorer projects, or they could be long-lived, like flagships or planetary missions. They often grow rapidly after the mission is adopted, so they might start small and then get a lot bigger. Now, the projects themselves use a hierarchical design. That's how NASA organizes everything. But the science team doesn't have to follow that, but it often, in my experience, does. So even though you don't have to have a hierarchical design for your science team, most people actually do. And the one other interesting thing here is that whether or not there's any rules at all set down for how the science team does their work seems to depend largely on the PI who's in charge of everything, or the small group at the top of the project, or a flagship. That's how things are set. It's just by the people at the very top. And now that means that as you're joining a team like this, you have to sort of figure out, you've suddenly been dumped into some large science team that's doing things, and you have to figure out what are the group norms, what are the rules, what are you allowed to do, what are you not allowed to do. And that makes group dynamics tricky. I mean, how do you know whether or not you're allowed to do this or not? And it means often that people who are pushier and more aggressive get more than people who are quieter and wait for permission to do something. So that ends up being less inclusive, less accessible, so you're no longer getting the results from people who are the best able. You're getting the results oftentimes from people who are the most pushy. Now, and then finally, I'll just note that for those of you involved in mission development for NASA, you probably have heard of NPR 7120.5. It's a giant document that lays out how an entire project is to be managed. But despite having many, many standards, this one being one of many, NASA doesn't really have a standard for how teams should work together. or even recommendations. So one of the goals that Serina and I both have is that we convince NASA that having some recommendations in this regard would be a good idea. And more to the point, even following up and then tracking how well these work would be an even better idea. So next slide. So I'm going to talk about the publication policies, which is really just one subset of what a full code of conduct, and that's what Serina is going to talk about. I'll note, however, that for many teams, the publication policy may be the only component that the team wrote down, because usually that's the one that has the most controversy. If you have a team that has, say, a small group of strong-minded people, then who gets to publish what and when is probably going to be the one thing that they worked out. How the overall code of conduct might have been left for some future date. And then if you have questions, specific questions at the end of my talk, please, we can take those in chat. And if we have enough, I'll answer them then. Otherwise, we'll just take questions at the end. So next. So publication policies, what exists? Now, one thing I'll just note here at the beginning of my talk, and I think it'll also hold for Serina, is that every time that I've talked about this with anybody, I end up with lots of war stories about what it was like for them on one project or another they heard about. I'm personally fascinated in all of those, although hearing about all of them right now is probably not going to be available for time. But if you have something to tell me about, especially anecdotes of what went wrong and how it got fixed, I'm very interested, because getting the what went wrong and how it got fixed information is really hard to do. If you want to send it to me in confidence, you're welcome to do that, and I will keep it in confidence. If it's able to be shared, that would be even more useful. But that kind of material, please just email to me and or Serina so that we can use it. So the first thing that I started with was doing a survey of asking people for what kind of publication policies to their projects they have. And one of the problems here is that even the term publication policy isn't all that clear. So I sent out a description of what I meant by publication policies. And the reason I say it's not entirely clear is that, for example, the AAS has all of their journals, and there is a publication policy for the AAS journals, the APJ, the AJ. All of those have a standard publication policy. But that deals primarily with ethics, with conflicts of interest, the issues that the journal is particularly concerned about. Mine here are things like, what is the approval process for a paper to be published? Who has the authority to use the data? Who has the authority to be the first author in a paper? What rights do postdocs or graduate students have to write papers on things that they find out? Who gets to decide? Who gets to give a talk? Who gets a presentation? What about presenting the results to the press or to the public? Those are the issues that I was really asking about. And then one in particular was, what are the enforcement mechanisms, and have they ever been enforced? Turns out that's actually an interesting question. So next slide. I was trying to get policies from as many different facilities, missions, projects. I tried to define this very broadly. And I started because I work in astrophysics. I started with my areas of astrophysics and the people that I know. This rapidly branched out to space science, to physics. The team sizes ranged from roughly 25 people up to about 3,000 for the biggest ones. I talked to my friends. I presented the topic to the AAS Strategic Assembly, which is a group of the heads of the AAS and all of the divisions of the AAS. Got an invitation to make a post for the Women in Astronomy blog, which got me some input. I sent tweets out asking for input. In the end, I got 18 documents. I got 9 people telling me, sorry, no, I don't have anything. Or, we're working on writing something, but we haven't finished it yet. And I got a couple people emailing me with examples of, here's what happened to me. Here's what I saw go on. It was an interesting collection of information. So next slide. So here's what I got. Now, like I said, all of this is written up in a paper that will be coming out in the bulletin of the AAS fairly soon, and I'll also be publishing it on AstroPH as well, so you'll be able to see it there. But you can see the types of teams that I covered. This is both ground-based, space-based, physics. So this includes the Atacama Compton Telescope. ATLAS is one of the two main instruments at CERN in the Large Hadron Collider. COBE, you might remember from years ago, the Cosmic Microwave Background Instrument led by John Mather. The Event Horizon Telescope, which is the one that got that amazing picture of the black hole recently. LIGO, LSST, Mars 2020, and you can see who is funding this, the size, who's leading the effort. Is it led by a PI or a board? What's their data release policy? And I'll mention that briefly. It turns out data release policies are really important for how this works out. And you can see here what I said that, they're not always called publication policy. We had names from science team guidelines. Some of them were codes of conduct. Some of them were science collaboration bylaws, is another title. Science rules of the road. And finally, you'll note that the length of these is not usually all that long. These are not, the documents that I found were not typically written as legal documents. They're written more for the use of the actual scientists involved to understand what the rules are. This has both pluses and minuses. I'm married to an attorney, and I understand the vital service they play, especially in providing clarity. Some of these documents aren't as clear as I think the authors thought they were, and that can lead to problems. So next page. What I found was that there were a few key components in almost all policies. They weren't the ones that I was expecting necessarily, although it was mostly what I thought I would find. And the 7 points that I found were common. Who has access to the data? Who gets to see the data? How do you start a project? Who do you have to tell? Do you need to get permission? Who has to be a co-author? Who can be a co-author? Both these are core questions. How can you add new authors, either new team members or just temporary authors for one paper? Who decides whether or not a paper is ready to be submitted or not? And what, if any, rules govern how you're going to handle a presentation or an invitation to give a talk? And finally, again, what methods exist for problems? When problems arise, how do you adjudicate them and who enforces them? So, next slide, and I'll go into each one of these individually. Who has access to the data? And I'll note here that the crucial aspect here is that access to data is the gold in this situation. Everybody wants access to the data, and ideally they want it when nobody else has access. You want your own data that you can then play with and do something with and write your own papers with. And in a number of cases, the only reason senior scientists or even mid-career scientists join a project is in exchange for access to the data. If they've got tenure or they can do anything they want, then the reason to put in time and effort into a project before it's years before it's actually going to present data is because they're holding out for the hope that they're going to get some data of their own to work with at the end of the day. Something to keep in mind when you're looking at should we have guaranteed time observations or proprietary data for users, is that if we want to have rules for this kind of stuff, often this is the only way to enforce them. And one way of seeing this is that, for example, the Large Space Synoptic Telescope, which is now the Vera Rubin Telescope, Large Synoptic Telescope, now the Vera Rubin Telescope, has an open data policy, and so the only time people to whom these rules are applied to are those who are paid by the telescope. Everybody else can follow whatever rules they want. And I was told that for at least one telescope satellite where the data are all public immediately, the PI found that he had people dropping out of the team after the all public data policy was announced because they said, why should I bother? Why would I want to do all this extra work that you're talking about doing if I don't need it in order to get access to the data? Next slide. How do you start a project? So you got a good idea, you want to do something with your data. Usually there's some sort of description that's written up, you write up what data you might need and who the co-authors are going to be, and you send that to a working group or a publication board or the entire team. It depends on the situation. And I'll pick out some unique aspects that I found when I was doing this. One of them is, for example, the Event Horizon Telescope, and it's the only one that did this, to find student projects, and this was meant to be graduate students. And the idea was that if a graduate student wanted to carve off some type of project, it couldn't be a major area of a goal of the EHT. So it couldn't be, my PhD is going to be about making an image of a black hole. But if it was something smaller than that that they could identify, then they were allowed to carve that off, submit it for approval, and if it was approved, then the student got a guaranteed 1 year to develop the idea and had the data necessary in order to do it. They couldn't get scooped. I thought that was an interesting idea. I did talk to the EHT team members about it and found out that it's not actually been used yet. So they laid it out as a detailed description, but it hasn't actually been used. So we'll see. Next slide, please. So how do you get to be a co-author? The physics approach, as you probably know, is that everybody on the team is a co-author on every single paper that gets published. So if you're Atlas, for example, and you are a team member of Atlas, then your name will go on to each and every paper that gets published. And even the order of the papers is named. So if your name happens to start with 2 or ideally 3 letter A's, then you're probably going to be first author on a whole series of papers coming out of the Atlas group. This is also done for the LIGO team, which I'll note has a physics heritage as well. My experience has been that, at least in talking to people in the astronomy community, they find this abhorrent. They really it just grates them in some way, because it means that, for example, you cannot tell who actually worked on a paper, obviously, just by looking at the authorship. Another approach is, and that's used on a number of publication policies, is this special class of people. So it's basically the people who got in early, who were core to developing the idea. They're called architects, they're called builders, they're the core team. These are often the instrumentalists, the people who were absolutely essential to actually making the instrument or the mission or the team or whatever it was work. And those people have some sort of special rights. Perhaps they have to be a co-author on all papers. Perhaps they are allowed to be a co-author on all papers just by saying that they want to be. Maybe in some cases, they have to be listed on the first paper of each area of science that's covered. It depends, but this is not at all an unusual method. And then there's the paper classes approach, where you classify papers into, like, this is a collaboration paper. This is the main paper that we're doing, and therefore this paper has everybody as a co-author. And then maybe there's an official paper which has all of, say, the special people on it, and a few other people, but not others, and then related, which could have anybody you like. The ordering is a whole separate issue, and it gets beyond complex, so I'm not going to try to summarize that here. So next. And one thing I'd really like to highlight here is that this paper classes approach seemed like a good idea to me. I thought that sounded like it had real opportunities, because you could just set up classifications. But I talked to a couple of people who had worked in this environment, and apparently one of the things you really have to watch out for is who does the classification. At least one team that I talked to, the idea was that when you submitted the paper, you classified it yourself. So when you submitted the paper idea to the team, you said, this is going to be a X-type paper. And what usually happened was some team members, often the ones who were writing the paper, felt that that classification was entirely appropriate. Other team members who perhaps were getting, shut out of being co-authors on the paper felt that somebody was playing fast and loose with the rules. And one of the things that I found was the easiest way to make people unhappy with this, with any kind of policy, is to have it be felt that somebody is cheating, somebody is playing, games with the rules, and they're not being told to stop it. And as soon as it seems like there's one set of rules for them and another set of rules for me, suddenly team cohesion goes out the window. So you need to be very much on the lookout for a fair and even distribution of who gets to do what. This is another famous quote of my wife, the lawyer, who notes that you need to have notice of the rules and then fundamental fairness in invoking them. And if you have both of those, then most of the problems can be omitted. But I think that that's something that should be thought about when you're putting together any kind of these policies, is that people have to be on notice, and then that whatever rules you set down have to be implemented fairly. So next slide. What about adding outside authors? Usually if you want to add just a special expert who knows a lot about one particular problem that you're working on, you need to get permission from the chair of somebody. New members require almost inevitably the PI or the board concurrence. And it's often contingent, membership is often contingent on continuing to do work. Although not all teams have this, and it's something to keep in mind. You know, if you want to use, there could be problems if somebody's allowed to join and then never does any work except, say, gets their name on every paper. That can cause problems. Another area of problems are, what about students or junior memberships? If you're not a senior person and you leave the institution that you were at, how are you going to stay able to continue to have access? Some teams have some sort of associate membership. Sometimes, if you leave the institution you're at and say take a job elsewhere, you lose all data rights and lose all access. So next slide. When can a paper be submitted? It was interesting. Every single team had a policy on this. Sometimes it was really easy, like you just have to distribute it to the team a few weeks before publication. There's no approval, you just have to have sent it in. Others, you have a full refereeing process done by external but to the authors, but internal to the team, who do a formal review process, and all of their review comments have to be addressed before you can even submit it to a journal. That's much more common in the physics community, and in the astronomical community, it's usually more lightweight, and even sometimes had exemptions for transient sources, high visibility sources, but it did vary all over the map. So even some of the astronomical papers had fairly rigorous processes for review. Next slide. What about talks? What about conference proceedings? This was an area where some teams had no rules whatsoever. Other teams had very detailed rules. In physics teams, and this surprised me, I admit, even a personal invitation, you know, from somebody saying, "Hi, I'd like you to give a plenary talk at my conference on, you know, this topic you work on," even those get forwarded to a central board to decide whether or not you get to give the talk or whether or not that invitation is going to be shared to somebody else. So rules dealt, you know, the rules were highly varied. So I won't try to summarize too much here, except to note for two interesting ones that I thought were useful. One team, the ICE 50 team, which is about looking for water on the moon, provided a standard info sheet so that if any team member was talking to a journalist, they would have a standard set of information coming from the team, including, for example, such questions as who owns the moon? And then another one that I thought was particularly useful, and I must admit I'm planning on borrowing this for ARCUS. Mars 2020 included a lengthy set of recommendations on the use of social media. Certainly didn't address every possible use of social media. I don't think that would be humanly possible, but it was definitely a good starting point. Next. I'm coming to the end. And then finally, how about disputes? How about problems? In PI-led teams, this is almost always handled by the PI. That works well, except the cases where the PI is in fact the problem. In board-led teams, which you saw were about half the ones that I looked at, sometimes it was the director, the spokesperson, the management committee. In one case, it was the ombudsperson, as some teams had defined ombudspersons. But I'll note that more than half the policies had no statement about how resolutions would be enforced. So you might be told that you can't do this, but no indication as to what happened if you just go ahead and do it anyway. And I'll note that rarely was there any penalty other than being expelled from the team, which in reality is often not a realistic penalty. So it's the, you know, you can do this up until the point where I, you know, shoot you dead is not a good system. So next slide. A couple of things I just thought were worth noting, because I thought they were good ideas. The New Start team, for example, had very liberal rules regarding data access. Essentially, almost everybody on the team had access to almost all the data, especially if it was going to be used for calibration purposes. But it noted the following. Team members must respect the role of science working group teams tasked with reducing data, do not scoop them by analyzing and distributing scientific results separately, even if only internally. Doing so will erode the motivation of teams, will demoralize students and postdocs, and will create mistrust and ill feeling within the science team. I think this is really the goal of a publication policy. The idea here, and even a code of conduct, the idea is not to have rules just for the sake of rules. It's to keep the team working together happily and usefully. And here I think NuSTAR identified, the PI, Fiona Harrison identified that there are ways that you can cause problems even if you're not doing anything that is overtly against the rules. So she made it against the rules. And then finally, EHT had a special rule for analysis software because they noted that in the case of doing complex, hugely complex data analysis, like analyzing radio data from sources around the world, that the analysis tools themselves are a critical part of the mission. And so they required that they be managed within the collaboration as such. And that meant, for example, that if you came to the EHT and one of the things that you brought was some software, then if you decided you were going to leave, you weren't allowed to leave and take your software away with you. You had to leave the latest version available for the team to use. That was a requirement. But if you were going to join the team, you had to guarantee that your data, your analysis software would stay with the team. So that was an interesting analysis. So I think I'm on the last slide here, one more. So yes, couple of immediate conclusions, and then we'll move on. Not all of these publication policies were openly available. Some I was given because I asked, and I was doing this under the auspices of the AAS Ethics Task Force, which I'm a member of, but they gave it to me only under the criterion that I not give it to anybody else. I think that's a bad idea. Most of us are being funded by federal governments of one kind or another, or national agencies, and I would expect that most of our work should be publicly available. Many policies emphasize how important it was to help students out. They didn't necessarily give students as many rights as more senior people did, and I think that that's something that needs to be thought about. If you're going to say that the importance is developing students, then you need to make sure that they have a fair set of rights. And the enforcement of rules, especially, I think, most importantly for minor violations, is proven problematic. And part of my problem is that most of what I found out about this is anecdotal, which is why I was asking for anecdotes to be please email to me, because if you don't have anything else, then you might as well collect anecdotes. But one of the things that we're going to be asking Serina and I, when we give a talk to headquarters later in December, is for headquarters to help us track this kind of material. I think that that's really the only place that it could be. So we could figure out what are the best practices. Because you can't say what's the best practice until you know how it's actually working in practice. So that's it, and I will now turn it over to Serina, unless there are immediate questions.
There was one comment thrown into the chat, if you want to look at that, from Julie Castillo, that I think it's timely for you to address now. Another aspect to consider is how data is made accessible to the community. So depending on how it is, PDF is the public repository for planetary data. It may be readily used by new investigators or might require involving mission scientists for some data sets. Wondering if you had comments on that.
This is absolutely true. I have heard about arguments on this point where, for example, various mission teams were told by NASA that they had to make their data public immediately, and they offered to provide the raw telemetry data, which would, of course, be of essentially no use to anybody, but it would meet the spec of making the data available. So how this actually works in practice is also a balancing act. I believe NASA normally requires that when data is made accessible, that it be made accessible with all of the tools and data reduction necessary in order to do something with the data, at least in the cases that I've seen in astrophysics. But I don't know what the rules are more generally. And it is an interesting question because it's not always, Julie is absolutely correct, it is not always just a matter of providing even the basic tools. If you don't know how the calibration needs to be applied, then you may not be able to make heads or tails of the data even with a complete data set. So this is one of those things where the rule might seem simple, but in practice it gets very, very complex. And really what's needed is good faith efforts. I think one of the issues that came through very clearly here is that the key is to make sure that people are operating in good faith. And I think from my viewpoint, the way to ensure that is to make sure that people feel like they're being treated fairly. It's only once people start thinking that the other side is being unfair or even that there is another side, that things start going south. So they can go south very, very fast.
That makes sense, and that's a good segue into discussing codes of conduct. You'll hear a lot of these same messages that Randall just brought up echoed in that discussion. So thank you, Randall. So as mentioned, we had a white paper, and I just want to thank my co-authors here who are involved in this. And I'm going to flip through it at a very high level. I'll try to pull out most of the main messages that we were trying to get across in this white paper, but I do direct people check out the white paper for full information. It's only 7 pages long. So briefly, the context for this white paper development is that we are seeing more and more conferences and meetings and even teams listing a code of conduct in their policy documents. By code of conduct, I'm specifically referring to a policy about how people are supposed to interact with each other. So, as Randall said, this can tie into publication policies, but this, in this case, I'm focusing specifically on interactions between people. Often these codes of conduct are phrased as, like basically be nice to each other. That's not a particularly useful code of conduct, but it's that type of messaging. And I'll get into what makes it a useful code of conduct. We've been seeing this in more and more conferences, meetings, and teams. And in May 2019, Dr. Thomas Nabukun introduced the requirement that all NASA SMD-funded conferences would have to have a code of conduct. So this phrase was out there, this policy, this tool for the community to use. However, very little information existed about what is this tool and how do we make sure it's effective. And so that was what this white paper aimed to address, was to try to start establishing a more common understanding within at least the planetary science community of what makes an effective policy. And how to put one into for your group and all of the environments where it might be useful. So beyond conferences, meetings, other research endeavors such as mission teams or even smaller research groups. These policies matter because the aim is to standardize and make transparent expectations with regards to a person's, with regards to what they're contributing and the environment that they're in. This has to do with safety, the ability of people to contribute, the support that they expect to get. All team members need to have this information available so that they can know that they have their personal needs and capabilities taken into consideration. And the overall aim is to create an environment and a policy that creates that environment so that these needs and capabilities are taken into consideration without anyone having to advocate for special treatment. So this is moving, the ideal is to move towards something that I pulled the term universal design. This is from architecture. So the idea is to design, for instance, a building that is accessible to everyone so that whether you are a pregnant woman or a man with a child or someone in a wheelchair, you can access that building, you can enter it without difficulty, you can access restrooms in that building, you can navigate the building, all of that together without having to get special treatment. That is the ideal, and so these policies are aiming to get there by putting down on paper the norms of the group so that new people coming in kind of know what to expect, and then additionally helping to broaden those expectations beyond what every individual may think is necessary to something that is more universally accessible, safe, and equitable. So to do this, we did a review of as best as we could with everyone on volunteer time of the Code of Conduct literature. So Code of Conduct policies have been written about much more in kind of company and industry settings. These policies became prevalent for companies starting in the 1990s. The aim was to add an ethical dimension to company policies. So in particular, some scandals had hit, and there were questions of, well, how are these companies responding in terms of taking care of their employees and making sure that they have good moral guidance to practices within their company. What's interesting is as we were reading these papers, many of the criticisms of these early policies are now the concerns that we have for how these codes of conduct may be used in the science community. In particular, questions of whether or not they have teeth. So that question of enforcement came up a lot, and that is one that we are seeing now in the science community. Are these just nice words on paper, or are these rules that actually apply to everyone and fairly? And do all employees have access to and knowledge of the policy? So those you'll see repeated in some of the recommendations that we came up with. Some of the studies looked at the effectiveness of these policies in industry. Very few have explicitly looked at these policies in science or research settings. And I think that's partially because it's just newer in our environment. But we scanned through those and pulled what information we could, and then we also looked at a lot of informed and calling them opinion pieces. These were articles written on the internet that clearly were drawing from a lot of bases but weren't necessarily peer-reviewed literature. We then took all that information. In parallel, we were also looking at existing policies to get a sense of what is out there, and then also to try to match up what we see in the science community with what we were reading about in these other contexts. So we looked at planetary mission teams, and here's a listing of ones where we had got full copies of their either rules of the road or their science team guidelines, which included publication and authorship guidelines. Very few actually included something that we would have termed a code of conduct, so specifically referring to how people interact with each other rather than referring to how people share data. And some of the other things that we noticed in these is that these rarely included explicit description of potential disciplinary actions and or reporting resources. So that led to one of our recommendations. Additionally, none in these mission team documents included explicit guideline about protected identities, and then very few had been or were planned to be reviewed or revised even once. So all of this wasn't about going through and saying, okay, this is good, this is bad. This is seeing what was out there. Many of these documents were written under different kind of societal climates, different levels of awareness. Code of conduct wasn't even necessarily on the radar for some of the authors of the original documents for these. But we wanted to see what was out there and then use that as well as the kind of the best practices from the literature to figure out, okay, well, what could be added to these going forward? What would make for better policies? We also looked at professional societies and institutions and their meetings. These were typically either called ethics or code of conduct policies. Again, these all included sometimes information about sharing of data or, accessing the presentations that were presented at the meetings. These did have usually information about expected meeting attendance, behaviors by people in attendance at the meeting. Many of these did include explicit protections for specific identities. However, some of these were very hard to find and or did not require explicit agreement. So it's hard, you want to know what rules you're being held to, and also if you think something might be in violation of a rule, you need to be able to quickly access this resource so you can check it and determine whether or not something was in violation, and then if so, what do you do about it? So then getting to the language on potential disciplinary actions and reporting resources. I want to highlight that for these professional societies, institutions, and their meetings, those policies, they really had quite a range in terms of level of detail. So for instance, USRA and LPI have a statement on harassment that applies to LPSC as well as all other meetings that LPI helps run the website and such for. But there wasn't much more beyond that, whereas others had, pages of documentation really detailing what the whole policy was. And then additionally, as we know from this year with the prevalence of virtual conferences, thinking through what the code of conduct and what the expected behaviors are in a virtual setting versus just in person. And there were very few that have so far adapted to that situation. Space science in context is one, oops, and I put down both. There should have been another one on there. Preventing harassment in science conference. Both of these were virtual conferences and held in this past year. And so they actually had policies designed around the environment of a virtual meeting. So if anyone's interested in those, I'd recommend checking out those web pages. So we had 8 recommendations, and like I said, I'll step through these fairly quickly. Recommendation 1 was to, of course, standardize the type of policy. This sort of transparent, documented here are the expected behaviors within an organized group endeavor is something that just has not generally been thought too hard about in the science community. As Randall said, you know, what sort of team do you want? Well, of course we want a good team. Okay, how do you get there? That generally has not been written down. And especially as we have more of an interest in having more diverse teams, and not just diverse in terms of having lots of different people there, but inclusive teams where everyone has equal access and has equal ability to speak up and share their ideas, because that is how the best science gets done, is if everyone feels safe in sharing their ideas so that you can bounce the ideas around and you can get those disagreements and resolve them in professional manners. That's how the best science happens. Additionally, we of course want science to be an accessible endeavor for all different types of people. But that stretches the social norms that you may have within a group, the assumptions about how to behave. So having something transparent written down really is a good practice, and we'd like to see it standardized more within our scientific endeavors. A effective code of conduct needs to contain these 4 parts. So first off, of course, unacceptable behavior. And the things that we saw that we labeled code of conduct had this, right? That's the bare minimum. One thing I'll point out is in making a statement of unacceptable behavior, it's, of course, minimum there is to say what is acceptable. You know, please be nice to each other and respect each other and create an inclusive environment. What can also be helpful is to give explicit examples of unacceptable behavior. It just helps prime the thinking on people's parts to maybe question or pause before engaging in behaviors that, you know, were not meant to be exclusive, but maybe. More sensitivity to the fact that we may have a diverse group and not everyone will respond the same way. The other thing that is commonly included are sometimes included, are clear instructions about how and to whom to make an incident report. So if you do see something in violation, it's very, very important that people have some idea of what to do then. You know, who do I talk to? Do I just note it down? Is there a hotline I can call? Do I do I go all the way up to the PI or the project scientist about this? How does one actually report this so that something could be done? So minimally feedback can be given to the person, be something small or something easily, you know, it was a mistake and we'll take care of it that way. Or if it's something big, that there's a record of it. But without those instructions, you know, it's the worst thing is to be in the middle of something that is deeply uncomfortable and not knowing what to do with it. Okay, here I put a red arrow because an explanation of how the policy will be enforced was often missing from these. And I'll get to in the next slide why that often is. But again, tied to the report, and this is something that Randall talked about, is sharing information about how the policy will be enforced and then giving people a sense that this will be fairly enforced across all people. This is very, very important. The other point here is, as Randall mentioned, your only enforcement should not be kicking people off the team. There's a gradation of what sort of unacceptable behaviors may happen, and so there should be a gradation in what sort of punishments or mitigation may come out of it, or rehabilitations may come out of it, right? You need everything from being able to just talk to someone and getting them the feedback and saying, okay, I understand now, please don't do that again, to potentially kicking a serial and very harmful person off the team. But it needs to run the gamut, and that needs to be made clear to the team that they have some trust that if a report is made about them, that they have a chance to talk it through and that they're not just immediately going to be kicked off the team, right? And then this last one, this one is very uncommon through all areas that we looked at, was making sure that the people who would be responding to incident reports to transparently put out there how they would be trained. It is very important for people who respond to incident reports to have some level of training. You may hear about things that are very uncomfortable. You may hear about things that are very surprising, and it takes training. This is not a natural thing to be able to take in and immediately respond to someone who might be a victim. Is certainly someone who's probably feeling very deeply uncomfortable to get the best information from them about what happened so that a proper investigation to whatever level of formality is able to occur, but also to make sure to respond in a compassionate manner. Okay. So I mentioned on the previous slide that often one of the areas that's missing is about the enforcement. So our recommendations 3 and 4 were that NASA and NSF should establish a template code of conduct language for the community. This template should include the reporting mechanisms, potential consequences and enforcement mechanisms, and liability that would be borne by the funding agency. The reason for this is twofold. One, as scientists in the science community, we are not trained to write code of conduct language. This really is not our area, and while everyone in the community should know more about this and become more aware of this, it would really be much more effective to have some template language and structure that we could all start with, at least, and then tailor for our specific circumstances. And then secondly, and most importantly, if you're going to have enforcement, that is most effective if it is supported by the umbrella and the funding agency. So many of our endeavors are cross-institution, and all these institutions have their own policies. And ultimately, whoever controls money, that's who gets to control, what's acceptable or not. So this is one of our main recommendations to NASA is that they should come up with some sort of template. And then we suggest that this template language and content should be required for all NASA endeavors, and it should be shared with NASA contractors, including organizations like LPI and Survey, who commonly set up meetings. This would help with the recommendation 1 of standardizing this through the community with the least effort on everyone's part. Okay. Recommendation 5 is about this explicit protection for community members. So this gets into explicit inclusion of language concerning race, ethnicity, gender identity, sexual orientation, ability, religion, spirituality, nationality, socioeconomic status, age, and intersectionality. So many of these are government-protected classes. It can be really helpful. One study that was done showed that by having explicit mention of these and that reiteration that these are protected and would be considered in the policy can be helpful for increasing diversity and inclusion within the team. Okay. Our 6th recommendation was that the team should have access and full knowledge of the code of conduct. So our recommendation here was to get periodic and explicit agreement from all group members, and that the code of conduct should be easily accessible for later reference reminders. And then, as Randall mentioned, it would be nice if these were publicly posted. We do government-funded, publicly funded works. Why not let them know how the teams are being run, as well as for people who might join the team to have a publicly posted, this is the sort of environment, these are the sorts of norms of the group, that they can look at it before joining the group. And doing so might help encourage people to enter knowing that it's a more inclusive environment. If they see things in the policy that they're like, yeah, okay, I think that this would be helpful for careers. Okay, and our final 2 recommendations were, of course, with any document that you write down, you need to be able to review it and update it. So that was our recommendation 7, is every code of conduct should be regularly reviewed to ensure it still provides clear guidance and brings equity and safety for all members in common group settings and scenarios and incorporates best practices. So for instance, a clear one is if you only have policies regarding in-person interactions, how well does that transfer over to a fully virtual setting, right? There's changes to the group, there's changes to the environment in which we're working in, changes in cultural expectations, and then changes in terms of what social sciences says, oh, here are things that really help. So it's good to have a regular review, and one way to do this is to have NASA or NSF aid the evaluation, provide standardized ways and tools for determining if the group's workspaces and practices are safe and equitable. So for instance, this could be a summary of any complaints made under the code of conduct in the group's resolution, and also if you can define some metrics, just, measuring how inclusive, equitable, or safe the environment and processes is. There was discussion of tying this to evaluation of the group itself. So for instance, like an extended mission proposal, we already have the technical evaluation and the cost-related evaluation, but tied to that, also doing an evaluation of the group dynamic and level of communication and inclusion within the group. This is a tricky area because what you want is to incentivize having the code of conduct and people reporting issues so that they can be addressed, and then the addressing of issues. You need to avoid a situation where you incentivize the hiding of issues. And so that, we didn't come up with a specific recommendation for how to do this, but we did throw it in as something for NASA to think about. But that would give a nice natural cadence, again, more from a top-down, from the funding agency, making sure that this evaluation is happening and that there are checks being done in the group to make sure that the best practices are being followed. Okay, those were the 8 recommendations from the Code of Conduct white paper. I know that was a lot of information there. I just end with this slide in terms of what's next. Randall has mentioned we're doing an SMD round bag mid-December, so actually this was our trial run of the presentation, so look forward to feedback from all of you. We are looking to encourage further discussion and sharing and recording of resources within the community. The aim, of course, is to standardize good practices so we can more effectively and efficiently improve our practices and our work environment and community and generate better science. And I just want to point out that a lot of this involves continued attention to social science-backed best practices. None of us are trained in this, and so we can come up with a lot of good ideas, we can work off anecdotes, but a really crucial way of improving the practice more effectively and efficiently is to also look at social science literature and use that information to figure out what we can do to improve our community. Okay.
Okay. Thanks, Serina. We've got our first question on the chat, and it's actually for me. So I'll just read it. What considerations have you seen in terms of different goals for missions and publication and data access policies? For example, when a policy covers the core science where the concern is being scooped, it may be very different from one where the goal is to move to a significantly broader community using a new data set where the team is more in a supporting role. That's certainly true. The EHT policies, for example, or certainly the EHT was going for a big splash. They wanted to make a noise heard around the world, which they succeeded at. Apparently, that picture of the black hole was seen by over 1 billion people, which is pretty good for something where you can't actually see the black hole since it's black. I didn't, though, even looking at that policy, it wasn't specifically tied to keeping things quiet. Now, I will note that policies like the LSSTs, where all the data go public, it's mostly just organizing the paid staff into how papers are going to be written in order to make sure that there isn't duplication of work. So I guess if I had to, it's an interesting point that I'll need to think some more about, but I would say immediately the biggest difference is that everybody is trying to organize to avoid duplication of efforts. Some people are trying to organize in order to make sure that there's fair distribution of who gets the hot papers and the cool topics. And you can sort of see a split there into how detailed the rules are. Groups that aren't worried about being scooped per se have lighter rules than groups that do. And then, Serina, you have a question.
Yes, thank you. So from Sue, she asked about regarding training for responders to difficulties. Do you have an example of the training? So my answer will be a little Caltech or JPL specific, although I think many institutions would have something like this. I've taken the Space Zone training down at Caltech through the Diversity Center, and that's specifically for LGBT allies. So things like that where I think, are learning how to be a better ally, understanding what perspective people may be coming in with, and especially for identities that you don't share yourself, and what sort of language they, what is the current language that is preferred, and how to carefully and sensitively ask questions. That's one. And then, of course, should you come across anything involving harassment, there's usually some sort of HR-based training about how to do that. Although there is a difference there, you know, mandatory responders may get slightly different training than just someone who wants to make sure that they're very sensitive if someone comes forward with something that may relate to harassment or discrimination, you know, not responding in a, like I said, compassionate manner, and one that doesn't shut down the person and also enables you to get information that would help with things. So, you know, what sort of questions to be asking about that would be helpful for people looking into it later. Those are kind of the high-level ones, the main high-level ones I would check into.
I would add to that as well, just to happen to know, the AAS has a ethics review board, and they also have their own training for that team. It's apparently fairly substantial, and so they actually have trouble getting people being willing to go through it all in order to be on the board. But there is a more science-based one as well, or at least specifically science-based from the AAS.
Okay, and we have a comment just in the chat concerned about NSF and NASA writing or approving policies and code of conduct if the wisdom is not resident in and NASA and NSF, or if the code of conduct is misinterpreted and misimplied. Okay, and we'll follow up over email.
No, it's a very good point. I would say that it's not necessarily that they have the resident experts. For the most part, people at NASA and NSF came out of the same academic environment that we are in ourselves. It's that they have access to the funding necessarily in order to hire people who have more experience than us. But I think I agree with Serina's point that it'd be better to have a uniform set of policies that was thought about by a lot of people and given a chance to have advice, rather than what one PI felt was a good idea at the time. Because individual PIs may not have particularly great ideas, and we're certainly not trained for this.
I mean, how many of us practice things because that's the way it's been done, or that's the way that we know, and we don't necessarily put the time and investment into trying to figure out, are there other ways of doing it, or is this the best way of doing it? It's hard. We have a lot of things on our plates.
Yes. And David has another comment, and I'm not quite sure I understand David's point here of thinking in terms of requirements for external participation. Perhaps, David, you could unmute and just ask the question live.
I was thinking in terms of one of the points that you brought up for many of the rules of the road was very formal rules for who externally could participate, whereas if your goal is sharing your data and getting the community to use it, you usually have very simple rules for that, as in, just tell me they're doing it.
Yes, that's a very good point. That can change dramatically. And the coordination aspect can get complicated, though, because, you know, you do have people asking the question of, you know, is this overlapping or not overlapping? But yes, you're absolutely right.
So I just want to be respectful of people's time, especially people like Randall who are on the East Coast. We are past the hour. Are there any last questions? Otherwise, we'll wrap this. Go ahead and unmute if you just want to do it that way. I'm not hearing or seeing anything, so I think we're good.
I wanted to thank you, Serina and Randall, for this really amazing talk with, you know, a huge audience, because you don't have this many at a seminar. I just want to thank you for giving the talk, and we are going to do more talks in the area of EDI. This is kind of a kickoff talk for this whole topic that we're really going to be scrutinizing. And just thank you. Let's all give a virtual clap to Randall and Serina.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks very much. And I have a really quick question. This is Sue, which is how much of what you presented here is in your white paper?
For me, mine is I pulling strongly from the white paper. So if you check out the white paper, it's got most of the information. And if you have any questions on that, do reach out to me. There's a little, we had to fit 7 pages, but we did try to distill down the main points and get them all in there.
Okay, great. Thank you.
And
Thanks for the great talk.
Yeah, same for me. If you would like a copy of my paper before it gets published, just email me. I'll be happy to send you one.